Hi, I'm Dave, founder of Halloween Year Round, and it's official. The DCEU is coming to an end. Aquaman 2 was never meant to close out a decade-long running franchise, but due to behind-the-scenes drama, changes in studio heads, and reboots upon reboots, here we are. And I find myself feeling bit of nostalgia, a bit bittersweet, really. I know the DCEU definitely had ups and downs. I've never seen a franchise other than maybe the Dark Universe so troubled. But at least, like, the Dark Universe was kind of, like, put out of its misery before it really got to live. This one just kind of went on and on. And with each new year, I hope that they would, like, oh, this is the year they'll finally get it together. This is the year they'll figure out what they're doing. And it feels like they never really did. So, 10 years, 17 movies, TV shows by my count. I just thought that, as this year comes to an end and this franchise comes to an end, and as we look to the future with James Gunn rebooting everything, with Superman Legacy, I wanted to give the DCEU its due, go back, kind of do a franchise retrospective, and one final ultimate ranking, which is weird to say, because again, you don't normally, like with most franchises, when you do a ranking of them, you don't know that this is going to be the last one. You're like, oh, well, they might do another one, they might do another one. But no, this time, this is it. This is it for at least the DCEU. So, as they say in Hamilton, let's rank them
one last time.
Number 17, Justice League. So let's just get this one out of the way. This is the theatrical Whedon version of Justice League. It's a movie that shouldn't exist the way that it does. It was stitched together like Frankenstein's monster. Whedon comes in, very different style, very different vision, and just butchers what Snyder had done. I'm not saying Snyder's version was perfect or would have been perfect at the time, however he was going to release it theatrically. I'm just saying that this was the very wrong thing to do with it. The way that Warner Brothers kind of did Snyder dirty and exploited, his personal family tragedy to get him off the project and come in and change it all, it's just really scummy. And I can't watch this movie without just thinking about that the entire time. And I guess it would kind of be worth it if it was a good movie, but it's not. It's rushed. It doesn't know what it wants to do. And I'm glad we finally did, years later, get what the movie should have been all along. Number 16, Suicide Squad. So kind of like with the theatrical Justice League, Suicide Squad is something of like a Frankenstein's monster in that David Ayer definitely had a much darker movie that, again, we'll never know because at this point they're never going to do the Ayer cut with how the Snyder cut, didn't quadruple the HBO Max subscribers like they wanted it to. So I don't think we'll ever see it. There's things I like about the movie, love Will Smith as Deadshot. Loved Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn. Loved Viola Davis as Amanda Waller. One of the best casting choices that even James Gunn kept up with, as the years went on. And I wanted this movie, this movie should have been a more thoughtful, darker look at villains and their psychology and all that. And they're just like, make it like Guardians, make it like Deadpool. So again, this is a movie that should not have been made the way that it was and was butchered in the edit. So that's why this and Justice League Theatrical kind of have to bottom out this list. Number 15, Wonder Woman 1984. So I was actually one of the staunch defenders of this movie when it came out. It was the first one with Warner Brothers same day release experiment where it came out in theaters, Christmas 2020, and there was also on HBO Max the same day. We watched it at home on HBO Max. And, my wife's a huge Wonder Woman fan. She loved it just because it's Wonder Woman. She'd love anything, Wonder Woman. And a lot of people were very quick to, it looks ridiculous. Kristen Wiig's Cheetah looks like something out of that weird live-action Cats movie. Are we really doing a movie about wishes? Can we talk for a minute about, Chris Pine and the whole uncomfortable thing about him taking over someone else's body and what Wonder Woman may or may not have done with it? Things that, granted, should make us question what Patty Jenkins was thinking, because the first Wonder Woman, she'll tell you that, DC and Warner Brothers kind of, micromanaged her a bit more. I know they made her change the third act. She didn't want to do that. This was all her, though. This was her having complete creative freedom. And this is what we got. Now, again, I defended it because it's campy, it's cheesy, but I felt like this was less a DCEU gritty movie and more a feature-length version of the old Wonder Woman TV show from the 70s. And if you kind of look at it from that perspective, it does elevate it a little bit, but it doesn't change the fact that it's still incredibly campy, incredibly cheesy, has very questionable themes and morals for a character that's supposed to be, a superhero. And it's not, I'm not saying that characters can't do questionable things. Batman does questionable things. But it feels like in his movies, those are put under scrutiny. But in this movie, it's kind of just like no one ever brings up, and the movie is not trying to criticize what Wonder Woman is doing, despite it being highly, highly immoral and unethical with this random guy's body. Number 14, Shazam! Fury of the Gods. So I don't outright hate this movie, and we're kind of at the point in this list, aside from the bottom two, I don't hate any of these movies. There's ones I just kind of bore me, and I'm like, what's the point? And that's kind of how I feel about Shazam! Fury of the Gods, because if you weren't going to do, Shazam versus Black Adam, what's the point? Like, yeah, you got Helen Mirren, you got Lucy Liu, you got Rachel Ziegler. They're all great in their roles as the Daughters of Atlas, but this movie just, like, why does it exist? What's the point of it? It doesn't really do anything to advance. The first Shazam was such a good movie, and this one just kind of does the same thing again. And, let me be like the 20th person to point this out on the internet, but there's definitely a disconnect between Billy when he's played by the teenager and Billy when he's Zachary Levi. Zachary Levi is still playing Billy like he's a 10-year-old. Meanwhile, real Billy is getting more mature, and it kind of begs the question, like, did they read the same script? Did they? And again, I feel Zachary Levi pointed out The Rock really kind of rock blocked them, for lack of a better term, on certain things and using certain characters, and I don't like the way he just kind of hijacked everything because, he was an A-lister, he felt like he could. All that being said, if you couldn't do Shazam versus Black Adam, could we do something more interesting than this? More interesting than, like, we got unicorns, riding unicorns through the streets. It almost turned into a Skittles commercial at the end. Number 13, Birds of Prey. So I was one of the few people that saw this in theaters right before, everything shut down. I really liked, I thought that it did a really good job of continuing Harley Quinn's character arc where she's kind of coming into her own. And I love the whole, like, Guy Ritchie inspired, heist film vibe that this movie has. The fact that they got the same fight choreographer from John Wick. This was a franchise that, relied very heavily on these big CGI spectacles. I liked that this one felt more grounded. I liked that there was no, like, world-ending stakes. It was just all these different characters out to get this same valuable thing and a crime boss. That being said, it's definitely kind of messy at parts. It's still trying to do that, like, James Gunn type humor without James Gunn, who eventually they would get, a year or two later. And I just feel like Ewan McGregor's role as Roman, the crime boss, I love Ewan McGregor, and I love him in like anything else he's in. He's the best part of the Star Wars prequels by far. He's trying too hard to be Nicolas Cage. It's like he went in and they're like, do your best Nicolas Cage impression. And it's like, I almost would have preferred just to see Nicolas Cage in that role. And I know that's a weird criticism. And again, I don't hate this movie. It's more so that just all the other ones I like better. And while I like parts of this movie, it doesn't quite make that top 10 for me. Number 12, Man of Steel. This is a movie that I think would rank higher if it had been allowed to be that standalone, Superman, Alien, First Contact movie that is always meant to be. Now, obviously, I understand that had that been the case, there wouldn't even be a franchise to rank, so whatever, sue me. But this is a movie that I like some of the ideas that it has, like the concept of, Superman arrives on Earth and it's the biggest event in the history of the world. That's a cool idea. General Zod, a man who does horrible, horrible things, but they seem justifiable to him. He's just doing what he's been trained and programmed to do, and I get that, and that's cool. It has some cool visuals. Snyder, for all his lacks, for all that he lacks with, storytelling and story structure and pacing, all of his shots look like, a beautiful work of art. But the thing I can't get over with this movie is it's trying way too hard to be Batman Begins. It doesn't have enough of its own, identity. There was no reason to kind of tell this story out of order the way that it does. And the fact that we get such interesting, cool scenes, like the whole prologue on Krypton is really cool. And it's like the rest of the movie doesn't quite match that level. It's trying too hard. Yes, I understand you want to make the character, look more inward and have more about Superman's own personal demons and all that. But for like the whole first act of the movie, Superman's treated like a mystery. It's more so from the perspective of Lois Lane. And I feel like if you want your protagonist and his personal demons and his journey to look inward to be like the whole point of the movie, you kind of have to let him be the protagonist. Number 11, Black Adam. It's fine. It's perfectly fine. It's fun. It's fine. The Rock is doing the Rock thing. It has some cool, fun scenes. But it's not... It's like the epitome of just like average, okay superhero movie. It doesn't... This marks the point on the list where everything before it is kind of flawed, and there's a reason why it's back there. And everything ahead of this one is really good, and it's just a matter of which one is better than the others. This one is like the most mid, so to speak. Cool concept. Wish we'd gotten Shazam in it. Really wish Superman had actually returned. And, that tease at the end hadn't been immediately negated like a week later. I'm not holding that against this movie. I just think that this movie, by the time we get to this point in the DCEU, it's still doing that sort of generic, introduction to superheroes. And again, Black Adam is supposed to be a villain. And much like the Sonyverse movies, like with Morbius and Venom, it doesn't really let him be a villain. It lets him be like, an anti-hero. But let him do bad things. Let him do things that are more ethically and morally questionable. Like, we see him be brutal against bad guys and villains. Let him do something that hurts innocent people, and then we kind of have to wait, this character's very determined to achieve his goals, but what is he willing to do it? And it never does that, and it winds up being like a $200 million vanity project for The Rock. And I think that's probably the best way to describe Black Adam. Number 10, The Flash. So, huge disclaimer at the beginning. When I talk about this movie, I am in no way condoning, endorsing, or, basically saying that anything Ezra Miller did is okay. I'm just talking about the movie. And the movie itself, I really liked. Yes, it has some iffy, questionable CGI. Yes, director Andy Muschietti probably shouldn't have said, "Oh, well, the bad CGI is the point." I mean, he also had some iffy CGI in the It remake, both chapter 1 and 2. So I'm not. While I still hold it against him for doing that, I'm not surprised he did that because that's where he came from. All that being said, this movie does a lot of really cool things. I love Michael Keaton back as Batman. He's used just enough. He's not a main character, and he's used just sparingly enough that I think the whole, gimmick of, oh, it's Michael Keaton back as Batman doesn't wear out its welcome. I really like Barry Allen's character arc here. I like the way that this movie kind of fixed the fact that this universe rushed in to do the crossover and Justice League, and it introduces Barry and Cyborg in Justice League. But because this is about time travel, it kind of sneaks in Flash's origin story. And I have to admit, Ezra Miller can act. Ezra Miller does a great job, playing Barry Allen. I am not condoning or endorsing anything else Ezra Miller has ever done. Just this performance. And it's a solid performance. Yes, it has its issues. Yes, the sort of roulette of CGI cameos at the end kind of do enter into, ethical, moral issues about, whether or not the certain deceased actors would have wanted their image to still be used. I think that's an important conversation to have, but as it goes, I think that it was a cool sequence the way they did it. I wish the CGI had been a little bit better with that, but as an overall story about time travel and about accepting the past as the past and sneaking in a Flash origin story, I really like this movie. I was one of the few people who saw it in theaters, and I will continue to defend this movie. Not its star, but I will defend this movie. Number 9, Zack Snyder's Justice League. So as a fellow creative, as a fellow writer, I admire getting to see a director just get to do their vision, unfiltered. And that's kind of what the Snyder Cut was. It was a victory of, the people, some very annoying people on Twitter, and I'm in no way, getting into bed with the Snyder cultists. I'm just saying it was cool to see a director whose vision was so poorly mismanaged and butchered get to actually show us that vision later on. That is a cool thing to see, and I'm happy for Zack Snyder that he got to do it. That being said, this movie is not without its issues. I really like what it does with, Cyborg. I love what it does with Flash. I love that, unlike the theatrical version, this movie gives each member of the Justice League their own character arc. It gives them all a reason to be there, and it gives them all a moment to shine. Yes, its 4-hour runtime is a bit excessive. Yes, there are definitely moments in it that I'm like, this scene probably could have been trimmed down a bit. But I also understand that when your movie is butchered as much as, Justice League was in theaters, I get the temptation to be like, you know what, for the director's cut, leave it all in. Don't cut anything out at all. Did we really need that weird song about Aquaman at that, Nordic village that Batman visits? Probably not. But we get a lot of really cool moments. We get an actual interesting return of Superman. We get an arc that kind of completes what started with him and Batman reconciling with each other. We get Wonder Woman kind of accepting the fact that, she has to be a hero and she can't be in hiding anymore. We get Flash literally running back in time to save the day and getting a really cool moment where he gets to be the hero. And as Snyder always said, we get a Cyborg who truly is the heart of the story. And it's so much of that is just brushed over in the theatrical version. It was cool to see that all played out here. That being said, I do think it works better as a miniseries. And if you break it up by the parts that, I feel like HBO Max probably should have just released this as a miniseries, already broken up like that. Because that 4-hour runtime is... I took a day off from work the day that it came out, just because I wanted to watch it. And I sat there and watched the whole thing in like 4 hours, and it was something. Number 8, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. So for this one, I am specifically talking about the Ultimate Edition. I didn't feel the need to put this theatrical version on the list as well and separate them the way they did Justice League, because I feel like Justice League, those are two very different movies. I felt like this one didn't need that treatment. But I am talking about the Ultimate Edition. So this version definitely expands it a little bit and kind of connects some of the dots that weren't there in the theatrical version. Again, this movie is not without its issues. I think it's trying to do way too many things at once. And I will jump on the bandwagon that Jesse Eisenberg is really miscast here. He's doing... I get what they were trying to do, and it's one of those things that I like the concept. Like, Lex Luthor has always been this, like, you know, greedy old businessman, you know, this sort of tycoon of industry. And I liked the concept of, let's do it a little differently. Let's make him a tech bro. That's a cool idea. So I give the movie credit for that concept. I just think its execution is way off. I think, you know, there's some issues with the pacing, but again, the Ultimate Edition kind of gives the movie more room to breathe, and the more time that passes since this movie came out, and the more times I revisit it, I think the more I appreciate not the overall structure of the movie, because again, it's kind of a mess, but I really love certain individual sequences from this movie that I find myself always going back to. I love the opening with Metropolis being destroyed, because it immediately gives us that motivation for Batman that we get, oh, this is why he wants to take out Superman. And it makes sense. I love the whole sequence where you have all these newscasters and talking heads talking about, like, the larger political issues around Superman existing. I just feel like, you know, the whole point of Man of Steel was, what if Superman came to the real world and how the real world react? That sequence captures that beautifully. I mean, they get Neil deGrasse Tyson playing himself in a movie, so that was really cool to see. Love the music. Love the chase scenes. I mean, it's probably one of the best Batman scenes we've ever seen in a movie, but that warehouse fight, that's the Batman that, you know, that's the Batman the criminals fear, and it kind of... Man of Steel was not a great Superman adaptation, but Batman v Superman is a decent The Dark Knight Returns adaptation, at least in terms of its tone and vibe. So I think if I had done this list a few years ago, this movie would have closed to the bottom, but it's something that, like, the more times I rewatch it and the more time that goes by, it kind of moves a little higher and higher for me. Number 7. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. So I know there's probably some, like, recency bias going on here, since this is the one that just came out, the one that I just saw. I really liked Aquaman 2. In fact, out of all, like, the sequels to these DC movies, this one's definitely my favorite over, like, Shazam 2 or Wonder Woman 2, or I'm not counting the Suicide Squad as a sequel, but we'll get to that. I really like the way that this one, a sequel is supposed to take the concept of the original and kind of just run with it. And I think this movie does that perfectly. We pick up, you know, with Arthur as King of Atlantis, being a parent, and I really like that James Wan takes that world building and just runs with it into a new direction. I kind of like that. I know people have used it as a criticism that, oh, there's no new villain, it's just Black Manta and Orm again. I kind of like that, because this movie doesn't force us to have to learn about a new villain and get to know their character. Because we know these characters already, it can just kind of hit the ground running. Manta's doing his thing. Orm, I really love everything between Arthur and Orm. I feel like this movie was everything Thor: The Dark World should have been. Number 6, Blue Beetle. So this is probably the movie that I feel the most bad for, with the whole, like, reshuffling at DC and the reboot, because it's a really good movie. I mean, I know I said earlier that, you know, Black Adam just feels like a generic, you know, origin story. I mean, Blue Beetle is your basic origin story, but it's one that I think is done particularly well. It's one that I think has really likable characters. I love, the family in this. And I say that there's a bias, I myself am half Mexican. The grandmother in this movie reminded me so much of my grandmother, my dear Nana, who is sadly no longer with us. And just kind of seeing this on the big screen reminded me of her. And it was cool to see, a Latino superhero as part of this major franchise. And I really hope James Gunn keeps his word that Blue Beetle kind of stays as is in the new DCU. I was even hesitant to even include this movie in this ranking because I know that there was some question about is it part of the DCEU? Is it part of the DCU? So for now, given when it came out, I'm including it with this, but don't be surprised if Blue Beetle pops up later, if I'm ranking the DCU and you see this movie up against Superman Legacy, if they do decide to keep Blue Beetle in it and bring him back. Also, George Lopez as the crazy conspiracy theorist uncle is something I never knew I wanted, but I really like him in the movie. My only real criticism of it is that, Susan Sarandon's kind of doing a generic bad guy thing, but other than that, this is a movie that's much more about the hero and about family, and other than Shazam, this movie captures that vibe and theme of family really, really well. Number 5, Peacemaker. So for this one, I am just talking about season 1, obviously because that's all that's out right now. And I know they're going to do a season 2, but I'm still, again, this is one I wasn't sure whether or not to include, but I felt like I had to, so I am going to count season 1 because it is still connected to the Suicide Squad and the rest of the DCEU. So this is a show that I was really not expecting to like it as much as I did. I will be honest with you. After seeing the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker was probably my least favorite character. I was mad at him for killing Rick Flag. And I felt like when I heard he was getting a show, I'm like, really? Him? He's just he's Peacemaker. He's like a one-note, character. What are you going to do with him? I'd rather see Bloodsport get a TV show. I'd rather see Captain Polka Dot, rest in peace, get a TV show. And it's funny because I remember, so this show and Book of Boba Fett on Disney Plus came out right around the same time, very early 2022, if I recall. And I remember I went into Book of Boba Fett with very high expectations, and I went into Peacemaker with very low expectations. And then by the third or fourth week, it was a complete reversal, where Book of Boba Fett was really disappointing me with how dull and boring it was. It was a show that should have been, The Sopranos, Star Wars universe, and it just wasn't. Meanwhile, Peacemaker, a show that I didn't expect much from. I kind of watched it out of obligation. I'm like, this show is amazing. James Gunn, and I should have trusted him because, he always delivers. He took this character that I didn't like and gave him so much depth. And they even addressed the whole Rick Flag thing, how it haunts him that he did that. And then while on the surface, he's this guy that, will kill as many men, women, and children as possible to gain peace, it still tortures him inside. And the more you get to know him and the more you see, the influence from his father, played brilliantly by Robert Patrick, everything kind of makes sense. And by the end of it, I'm like, why was I not looking forward to this? This is the best superhero show I've seen in a while. This is Marvel, take notes. This is how it's done. Number 4, Wonder Woman. So this was a very early kind of victory for the DCEU. I know at the time, Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad had kind of lost a lot of people, and this showed us this is how you do a superhero origin story. I love that it's a period piece. You can really see the influence of Richard Donner's Superman. And I love seeing an origin story where, this character comes into her own, and she's a hero that's a hero because it's the right thing to do. DC was always meant to be, gods among us. And I think that this movie took that concept and did it really, really well. I love the way that, even the color grading changes when you go from the Mascaria, to wartime Europe in World War One. That's when everything starts to look more bleak and, frankly, more like Snyder. But it makes sense for the tone and vibe of this movie. I thought she and Chris Pine had amazing chemistry. Not going to get into what happened in the sequel, but in this movie, I thought they had really good chemistry, and it's kind of, he gets to do the heroic sacrifice thing, and it's a movie that is very like girl power, girl boss, but without ever feeling like it's trying too hard to be that. It's not. It ends up being a very feminist movie and giving us a very strong, female lead without feeling like it's trying to force, an agenda. It never feels that way. It just gives us a really good, interesting character, and it gives us moments for her to shine. So I think, like, this is how it's done. This not just how you do a good female movie, a female superhero movie. This is how you do a good superhero movie, just in general. Number 3, Aquaman. So for a while, this one was, when it first came out, this was like at my very top of the list. And it was because just everything worked. Love Jason Momoa in the title role. They took a character that was kind of a punchline and cast Jason Momoa and made him like awesome and badass. And he rocks that OG Aquaman outfit. I love that in the sequel, that's what he's wearing like most of the movie. I love the world building here. Like, I want so many more movies set in this underwater world. Like, you've got sharks as cavalry. You've got an octopus playing drums. Like, there's so many weird, crazy visual things that the movie isn't sitting there, exposition dumping on you. But it's just there in the background for you to see. And I think that was probably the biggest achievement of Aquaman. That and CGI that actually looked amazing. Like, the vast majority of the underwater shots, they're being done with some sort of CGI to make them look underwater. But they look amazing. And I love that, of course, I'm a huge James Wan fan. I'm a huge horror fan. I love that there's moments that he goes horror movie, like with The Trench. So this was just a movie that, it was a breath of fresh air that this universe desperately needed. You got to remember, this after the theatrical Justice League and all the issues with that, it was a whole 13 months before the next DCEU movie, and that was Aquaman, and it wound up being a very much needed breath of fresh air. Number 2, Shazam. So this came out only a few months after Aquaman, and it definitely felt like it was DC moving in the right direction. We were getting away from, I don't want to say like that it was just good to get away from dark and gritty, because dark and gritty isn't a bad thing, but it's a bad thing to do every movie dark and gritty. Somebody tell Zack Snyder. It's also a bad thing to do everything too fun and lighthearted. Somebody tell Marvel. But this was the era where it felt like DC was getting it right with their solo movies. And that continues with Shazam, a movie that is heartbreaking when it needs to be, it's funny when it needs to be, it's poignant when it needs to be. I think we can all relate to feeling left out, feeling alone. You take this protagonist, Billy, he's an orphan, he's moving into a new group home, or a new foster home, and he's not sure what to expect. And lo and behold, he becomes a superhero. And what I really liked about it is Billy was, at this time, he's the first DCEU superhero that isn't some larger-than-life figure or god. He's just a kid. He's just a regular kid that becomes a superhero. And I love that it runs with that concept. Like, how would a kid act at getting superheroes? Well, of course he'd be ridiculous. Of course he'd do all the Zachary Levi hijinks. Which makes sense in this movie because Billy is younger. I know I mentioned that with Shazam too, but here it makes sense. And here, Zachary Levi, I think, was the perfect choice for this story in this movie. I also really like, again, this is another horror director. This is David F. Sandberg, coming off of Annabelle Creation and Lights Out. And I love the way he does the 7 Deadly Sins. because they feel very much like something out of a horror movie. So this was just, and it was just meta enough with like the kid playing with the Batman, Superman action figures and throwing them aside when he saw Shazam. It was as if that was DC saying, hey, we're starting a new era, we're moving in the right direction. And finally, number 1, The Suicide Squad. It's funny how the first Suicide Squad is like next to bottom on the list, and The Suicide Squad is at the very top. It's almost like bookends. But I think that's how vastly different they are in terms of character, story, and quality. This was DC at its smartest, saying, hey, James Gunn, we know Marvel did you dirty. We know they fired you. Come over to us, do whatever you want, and have complete creative freedom. And the result is this amazing film. It's a film that it completes Harley's character arc that started in the first Suicide Squad, continued in Birds of Prey, finishes here. The fact that, she's willing to kill that general that, she was infatuated with because, she realizes he's a bad guy. It shows growth. It shows growth. Idris Elba's amazing. This cast has just the best chemistry. I mean, Idris Elba, David Asmalchian. You bring back Viola Davis. That was smart of James Gunn. Keep just enough continuity to the old one with Harley and Captain Boomerang and Amanda Waller, but turn over a new leaf. I really like the way it subverts expectations. This was a franchise and a genre that very much relied heavily on sky beams at the end. I love that he turns the third act into a kaiju movie, and I never thought in a million years that a scene of a bunch of rats jumping into a giant eyeball would honestly be a tearjerker. But it's so... James Gunn is the best person at taking, characters that are basically like a ragtag group of misfits, and like they find a family with each other. It's what he did with Guardians, and it's what he does with this, but because it was allowed to be R-rated, he was allowed to go full James Gunn with it, like with the gore, the violence, and, obviously some of the language they use. It felt like just an edgier version of Guardians of the Galaxy, but I love that. I love that, he does these ensemble pieces, but they never feel like they're riffing off of older ones, because he cares so much about the characters. And it's the fact that he does care so much about the characters that I'm really optimistic for the future of DC. Because I know if anyone can do this right, it's James Gunn. No one cares about the comics or the characters more. And, I'm genuinely excited to see what he does. And if Superman Legacy is half as good as The Suicide Squad was, I think the new DCEU, is going to be off to a good start. But like with all things in life, you can't build something new without having to leave something behind. And I do feel bad. This franchise never quite found its footing. There's movies I really like in it. There's movies I really don't like in it. I'm still sad to see it end, and that's not just because it's not ending on its own terms, which that's also sad, but I'm sad to see it end because there was amazing potential there. Had maybe different people been in charge at different times and had different creative decisions been made, I think this was a franchise in a universe that very easily could have rivaled Marvel, and it never did. But now, Marvel's in decline, and it might be DC's time to shine in the sun with Superman Legacy. So we'll have to wait and see in 2025. But that is a wrap on the DCEU. That is the last ranking I will ever do of it, or anyone will ever do of it, now that it's officially over. But I want to hear your guys' thoughts, because these are just my picks. These are just my favorites. So please leave a comment below. What are your rankings of the DCEU? What are your favorite movies in it? What movies did I get totally wrong? Which ones should have been higher? Which ones should have been lower? Like, share, subscribe, all the YouTube stuff. If you don't, your life might get rebooted by James Gunn. And as always, every day is Halloween.